For many years we have made pickles at this time of year, usually a little earlier, and this year Morgan and Liam are taking the lead. They have just returned from picking up the bushel of cukes and are washing and trimming now. I assume that's what you're doing here, Morgan?
Yes, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to trim.
All right, we'll talk more about the trimming in a minute. Liam is washing cukes here because he's done washing the dishes.
I didn't wash the dishes. I'm did.
Ah. Cukes. Many jars. Many
Maybe not
jars.
enough jars, though.
Quite possibly not. So the plan is about 30 quarts of dills and a couple of double batches of bread and butter and mustard pickles. Here's our bushel of cukes. It's not quite so full now.
The farmer said it weighed like 70 pounds, so it might be more than a bushel. A full bushel is supposed to be like 50 pounds, so I don't know. I didn't weigh it though. So.
Oh, I don't know. All right. So, what are you doing, Morgan?
I am trimming off the blossom end of the cuke.
And by trimming, how much are you cutting off?
I think it's like 1/16 of an inch. Very little. You're
Yeah.
just pulling off the...
So a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch.
Trying to keep it.
And what we believe, and it seems to work, but the recipe says that the reason for doing this is to help them stay crispy. I do not understand how this works. Or if it does, or if it's just a weird fantasy. But this recipe, which we got from the Bernardin canning phone line, is that right, Beth?
Pardon me?
Where did we get the dill pickle recipe?
The Bernardin pickling phone line. I picked up the phone and I said, I need a good pickling recipe. And they gave it to me and I wrote it down. And the recipe the children are using is actually hand typed on a piece of paper that's glued into our recipe book.
And what year was that?
Probably, I don't know, early 90s?
Yeah, 92, 93, something like that probably.
Yeah.
So we've been making these pickles a long time, and they've been very successful. Bernardin kosher dills. I don't know if you can get the recipe from Bernardin anymore, but we'll post it below this video. All right, check in later. So one of the obvious ingredients for pickles, as we mostly talk about them, is cucumbers, of course, but it doesn't stop there. Lots of vinegar and other important ingredients. We've got pickling salt, which is just a coarse salt. I don't know if it's iodized or not. Don't really care. This is this the mustard powder for the mustard pickles?
Yeah.
All right. And then a bag of pickling spice, which is just a spice mix. So
this one is
it's
different than the one we had before, actually. It doesn't have any cloves.
interesting.
And
So,
it just has cinnamon, maybe?
yeah, it looks like bits of cinnamon and allspice and coriander seed. And there's usually some chilies in there, though we'll be adding some of our own, probably pieces of bay leaves. At any rate, you can find it lots of places. It's just called pickling spice. And then just some small dried chilies. You probably don't want to use anything really intense like
Those ones are
bird's
chili
eye
out of
or whatever. What are these?
bowl. Chili out of bowl.
Outer bowl, right.
ARBOL.
ARBOL. All right. So that's what we're using, and I think that's what we've always used. They look very familiar. We'll go into the recipe more later. And then, of course, for the dills, dill. We have this big bunch of dill, and it's the heads we use. So dill weed is fine, but it's not really fine enough for dill pickles. We want to use the heads. Let's try and get this in focus. There we go. You want to use the heads for the dill pickles. They've got good strong flavor. You can see the kind of yellow tone of the flowers coming out there. So Beth is cutting the sliced pickles for the bread and butter here. We're using the food processor. Slicing disc, but the thicker one. Depends on how much you've got going there, but these are probably about 1/8 of an inch thick. And we think that's a good thickness. You don't want, paper thin. Let's get that focus there. Oh, that's not working. There we go. You don't want paper thin, but you don't want too thick either for this. And we're going to get that filled up and cover it with ice and salt and sliced onions. It's going to be great. So we've washed and trimmed up cukes. We've stripped the dill heads off. They're sitting here waiting to go in jars, and we're starting to pack jars. So in each jar, the bottom goes a head of dill, and then we're going to put some garlic in. Morgan's peeling all that up right now, and then we'll put in the other pieces in the recipe. I'm going to do that now. While Morgan's doing the garlic, I'll probably start hacking garlic into jars. All right, so I've got my garlic chopped in here now. The recipe says chop fine, and you can do that if you're feeling energetic, or you might throw it all in a food processor or something and scoop it out by the teaspoon or something, but I just hand cut it over the jar coarsely. It's fine. I like to get nice exposure. If you're not that into garlic, you could probably even just drop a whole clove in if you want, because then you're not going to get serious exposure. It won't be as strong. Anyway, so that's the garlic. Now I'm going to do the salt and the pickling spice. So we've put the salt and pickling spice in these jars. A teaspoon of pickling spice, a tablespoon of coarse pickling salt, and now Morgan is popping the chilies in the jar. It says a half chili in each one, but we mostly can't be bothered to break them up, and they're not that hot, so we just throw a whole chili in each jar, or a couple in the big jars. Oh, that's the other thing. Because these are hand packed, you can really just kind of go with the ingredients you've got. The recipe calls for 7 quarts and a particular number of cukes to do that, and there's no reason you can't follow that, but you can also just kind of improvise around what you've got. I do recommend that you stick with liter jars and above. The recipe starts to get a little problematic if you're trying to improvise in little jars. These ones are not quite a liter. These are those pasta jars you get from, what's that brand? Classico. But there are others. They're only $7.50. They work in a pinch, and we're kind of short of jars because everybody's using jars right now. So we are going to use these, but typically these would be too small. And I definitely would not use pint jars for this, though I suppose you could if you were keen, but it really works best with liter, or we've got these nice big 2-liter jars that if you're a big dill pickle consumer, work pretty well at home too. All right, so we're going to pack the jars now, and you can pack them however you want, but you definitely you want to try and avoid a lot of empty space in it. So you can see Morgan's tilting the jar a bit here, especially to get started. It's hard to sustain that as you go on, but it's a good way to get the bottom of the jar packed. You can get the cukes lined up neatly side by side, and feel free to sort of pick over your stack of cukes to find cukes that are going to fit the right spots at the end, rather than just being committed to what comes to hand. And then once you get into the top, you're just whatever fits. You need to leave a little bit of headroom, like Morgan's doing there, because we're going to stick one more head of dill in the top, and then we don't want it right up to the top. We need a little headroom for the brine and for the canning and the processing later. We'll talk more about that. Some people don't bother processing their pickles. They just go with hot brine. We do process it. It just makes sure that everything's okay, that you're not growing anything nasty. But given how acid everything is, it's probably okay if you don't want to bother doing that too. But you're never going to find someone to tell you to do that these days. Anyway, I'm going to help Morgan pack. So we're nearly done packing the jars we've got. So don't be afraid to really ram them in there. You don't want to break the cukes, but you can certainly use force. You want to try and pack them pretty tight, as I said, and kind of fill it up. So we're trying to do that. Unfortunately, because we're winding up using some smaller jars, we're trying some stuff. I don't really recommend cutting them in half like this, but because we're a bit late, the cukes we've got are all, I think, number 2, and usually I've tried to order number 1 and number 2. So the number 1s are a little smaller and make it easier to kind of fill in some of the gaps in the top of a jar. So we'll see. We'll report back on how they do when they're cut. I suspect they're just going to be a little more soggy. Doing them whole definitely gets more solid cukes. Sorry, solid pickles. Nice and crispy. Yeah, you can see Morgan really wedging that in there.
They bend.
They bend. And then we're going to top each jar with a bit of dill. Another head of dill. And actually, I'm washing up because we're a little desperate here. Went through the canister shelves and found a couple more jars that we can use. Got the dill on top, and we are all packed and ready to top up with brine. So we better get the brine going. All right, so here's our pot of brine. It's this 50-50 food grade vinegar and 50% water. And so we bring that pretty much to a boil, and then that will be poured into these jars. So filling jars with brine, and it's best to connect this process as closely as possible to the processing, so that we're not wasting heat here and time and having to reheat things in the canner that we could have held on to the heat of here at the jar stage. So I've got a batch out in the canner. It's just about ready. So I'm trying to get these ready to just go in as soon as those come out.
So you've got 2 batches nearly done?
Well, I've got, yeah, so there's 1 batch on the bar.
Right.
Heating the lids. The reason for heating the lids is not actually to sterilize them, because mostly they just come out of a box and they're pretty sterile anyway, but it's to get the rubber rings soft so that it seals well on the jar. So over here we've got the canner going on camp stove outside. I'd hoped to do it on a bigger one to bring things up to a boil faster, but that's not how the day went. And so we're doing it here on this little Coleman. It works okay, probably about as well as an indoor stove, which is to say not quite well enough to quickly bring things back to a boil. These canners are pretty cheap, so they get pretty hot fast. So here's our jars, trying to bring them back to a boil. And then once they're at a boil, they're supposed to process for 15 minutes. My canner's now boiling again. You can see it occasionally spitting water out the side. This is kind of a function, the fact you're supposed to have a couple of centimeters of water over the top of the jar, but our canner's a little on the small side, at least for these liter jars, and certainly for 2-liter jars. I should probably look for a much bigger canner. Now the purpose of the actual canning process, this processing time, is to make sure you've kind of killed all the bacteria that might be bad in there. And so depending on what's in there, sometimes they'll say 5 minutes per pint or 10 minutes per pint. But as I say, pickles are such a high acid environment that stuff isn't going to make it anyway. So to some extent the processing is performative, and the reason for the time in the processing is to be sure that the temperature's got a chance to get all the way through to the center of the jar, that everything in the jar is kind of up to boiling temperature. Once it's there, it doesn't need to be there for long to kill the bacteria. Just reaching boiling's enough. but the reason for the extended time is to make sure that that temperature is being reached in the center of the food itself. At any rate, we're boiling now. I'm probably just going to give it another 7 or 8 minutes, and then I'll pull them out. All right, I'm going to pull these out now and put them aside to cool. So we started with a bushel of cukes. We packed a lot of dills, and we've now cut up 2 whole batches for bread and butter and for mustard pickles. There's mustard pickle cuts waiting, and we still have some cukes left. So Morgan is packing up a few more jars here, and so in the end, I don't know, 32 quarts or something. Something like that. So here we have the mustard pickles sitting with onion and I think salt. Beth will probably be back in a minute and she can tell us more about what's going on here. Well, there's chopped red pepper, and then I guess this is the spice mix.
That is with the so it's got mustard powder and turmeric and sugar. And I think possibly some pickling salt. Morgan has the recipe over. Ginger, no salt.
All right. And then chopped red pepper. And these are just more thick cut than the bread and butter. And they're with chopped onion. Whereas in the bread and butter, which are over here chilling under ice, onion, salt, and ice, is that right, Beth?
Onion, salt, and ice. And the onions are sliced in the bread and butters.
Yeah. And we slice the cukes a little thinner in here. Little plan here, Morgan.
So all of the dills are in jars. We'll have 1 more to brine. And then in about half an hour at 2:30, we'll have the first batch of mustard. We'll start cooking and jarring those, and then we'll process them. And then at 3, we'll have the first batch of bread and butter, the second batch of mustard to cook and jar, and then at 5, we'll have the last batch of bread and butter, and then we'll be done.
Hooray! Lots
Woo!
and lots of pickles.
1 bushel into lots of pickles.
I was just checking on these, and I see floating spice. This is not a good sign. It says to me we broke a jar. I've long since lost my canning frame. So it's a risk with direct heat on the bottom. I did put gravel in the bottom of the pot to keep things off the bottom so they're not getting the direct heat, but something's gone wrong here. Anyway, we'll see. We won't know until the end of the processing time because I don't want to take them all out right now. But probably we're going to have a big mess in here shortly. I mean, quite obvious which the broken one is, and you can see garlic floating around now. Wasn't as chopped as I might have done it, but you know, hard to get good help these days.
The last one we were gonna take.
Well, except it's going to bounce around and be in the way, so we're just going to try it. So, all right, that went less badly than I feared. Sometimes everything spills out and it's a real train wreck.
It was well packed.
Yeah.
You can see the bottom is completely gone.
See, the bottom blew right out of this jar, and things didn't fall out because it was well packed. Unfortunately, there's really nothing we can salvage from this. Everything about this is trash at this point, but that's life. Sometimes it happens. Well, it's probably safe from glass, but the cukes are partly cooked now. Like, to start over again, they're probably just not going to be very nice. And nobody's going to want them, but they'll be mixed in, and so we won't know. So it'll be the nasty surprise jar. So I think we'll just call it, and this will all go in the trash. Full complement of dills for 2020. So those will last a little while. So considering how many people want them, it's funny. This is often felt overwhelming, but I look at this in the state of the pandemic and knowing who all will want pickles, and I think, I don't know. So we're doing the mustard pickles now. We're filling those jars. It was all brought to a boil, and now Morgan's filling them up. Funnel makes it easy to not make a mess because it's actually really important that we keep the rims clean. And if we get anything on, we need to use a very clean wet cloth to wipe the sugar and brine off. Otherwise, the lids will not seal properly. We need to have a clean jar edge. And I'm going to run a knife around the inside of the jar in a sec just to make sure that everything's settled and in under the brine. And you're not supposed to put your dirty fingers in like that.
Food safety is first.
And then I'll make sure that the edges are clean, pop the lids on, and away we go with the processing. So you can see we've left about a centimeter of headspace in there. Let things process cleanly. Just put my lids on. And we're almost done this first batch. Well, we ran out of space on phones, and we're kind of busy making pickles, so we couldn't really solve it at the time. So no more video of the pickle process, but you've seen pretty much everything that's important. The recipes I'll post in the description below this video, and you can find more general information about canning online, or there's lots of good books around. One that we've used a lot over the years called Keeping the Harvest. No idea if it's still in print, but who knows? And now, just to finish, here's a lovely picture of all of our pickles, including 3 jars of pickled eggs I made at the end of the process. I don't have a specific recipe for those, but I'll just I'll make a note in the description below. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you have fun making pickles too, or at least just enjoyed the vicarious thrill of watching this business. One thing I will say is that you watched us make pickles out of a bushel of cucumbers, and with 4 people, that's pretty doable in a day. Beth and I have done a full bushel together in a day, but that is a full day process, and I don't really recommend it. If there's only 1 or 2 of you, draw the line at a half bushel. Otherwise, you will just lose your mind, and you'll be wondering what to do with all these cucumbers. But if you've got 4 people to be involved, a bushel is very doable. All right, thanks. See you around.